بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا أما بعد. Okay, I'm just seeing how long this thing is. Not that long, so I'm kind of confined to this region here, so that's okay. Okay, so Bismillah. As you can see, I've titled the talk that I'm about to put forth, The Ongoing Liberation of Syria, because even though Bashar has fallen, alhamdulillah, and it's an incredible moment, it really is, and we can't understate the significance of this, the fall of this great dictator that has been a stranglehold. His family have been a stranglehold on Syria for 54 years now. That being said, there is an ongoing struggle now since he has fallen, because the yoke of American hegemony is still heavy on the region, it's still heavy on Syria. So this is, I guess you could say, the first part in the ongoing struggle. And what I intend to do is to try and demystify what's happened, why it's happened, how it's happened, and go back a little bit and have a look at the last 13 years and see how this is all unfolded. Because it has to be said, the Syrian conflict since 2011 has been one of the most complicated conflicts in human history. I mean that, having a broad understanding of the conflicts that have come and gone over the centuries, this one is certainly unique. So really it's about giving you a context, a little bit of background, and trying to understand what's happened now and what we can project for the coming months and years perhaps. To begin with, I want to talk about this man here. This is the father of Bashar al-Assad. His name is Hafez al-Assad. Now, he originates from an Alawi tribe, a subsect of the 12 Shia religion. They historically originated from the Latakia region of Syria, which is off the coast, or very close to the coast, the Mediterranean coast in western Syria. Now, for centuries before the 20th century, they were very insignificant. No one really paid much attention to them. They were a small tribal group, a very, very extreme subsect of the 12 Shia religion, such to the extent that their religion cannot be considered in the fold of Islam. One of their many deviant beliefs is that Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu ta'ala an is God incarnate, wa'adhu billah. So, and they have many other very, very peculiar beliefs. Now, when the French took control of Syria after World War I, they used minorities like the Alawis as a way of controlling this country, this region. Of course, it's the French and the British that drew these borders of Syria, of Lebanon, of Palestine, of Jordan, of Iraq. So these are all manufactured borders that emerged after World War I. In Syria, they used groups like the Alawis in the military as a way of controlling, as a way of gaining loyalty over the minorities of these countries, which were often marginalized over the centuries. They were then propped up by the French as a way of gaining loyalty from these minorities that will then be able to control the country. So all of a sudden we had a disproportionate amount of Alawis in the military in Syria. And that was a way for Alawis like Hafez al-Assad to sort of climb up the ladder and status in the society. Now, in 1946, Syria gained independence. And the military was, again, another, one of the main ways for minority groups like the Alawis to gain upward mobility in Syrian society. And at the similar kind of time, a new party emerged called Al-Ba'ath, the Ba'ath Party. They emerged in 1947, founded by a Christian Syrian. And Hafez al-Assad was a young man at that time, and he joined this party because it was a secular, non-Muslim, secular Arab nationalist group. And it seemed like a vehicle for people like Hafez al-Assad and other minorities to gain prestige and status and power within Syrian society. So he joined that group, and that group eventually gained power in 1963. And in 1970, he was rising through the ranks of the military, and there was a split within this Ba'ath party that was the ruling Ba'ath party in Syria at that time. And through a bloodless coup, Hafez al-Assad, came to power. And some of the actual Ba'ath that lost out ended up getting exiled into Iraq at that time. So in 1970, Hafez al-Assad became the leader of Syria. Okay, so we have a minority group that are now disproportionately in control of the Sunni majority of that country. And as he came into power, he enforced his position by giving power to those from his own family, from his own tribe. So he packed his government, his secret police, his army with people that were loyal to him. He was the deep state, and that's a very important point to note because that will come into effect later on as we carry on this discussion. So there he was, and he ruled with an iron fist, authoritarian, brutal, secret police, very, very secular in his projection of his power as well. And that all came to a head, I guess you could say, with the most notorious incident in his rule, which was in 1982, which was the Hama massacre. And that was a 27-day siege of Hama, which was attempting to crack down and eliminate an uprising that was taking place or had been taking place for the last 4 years prior to 1982, for about 4, 5, 6 years actually. Mainly led by the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood at that time. And they cracked down with brutal authority for 27 days. They laid siege to the city, attacked, destroyed, pummeled, and completely obliterated the city. Some estimate that around 40,000 people were killed in this period. That is astonishing. But that just goes to show the brutality of the individual we're talking about. And, of course, he passed away in 2000 and was replaced by the man Bashar al-Assad, who has recently fallen. And like father, like son, he continued the policies of authoritarianism, of secret police, of disappearing people, and so forth. So it was much more of a continuation of his father's policies that happened over the last few decades before he emerged onto the scene. Now, also, and quite interestingly, and it's worth mentioning, that after 2001, and with the war on terror narrative that emerged from America following the World Trade Center attacks, Bashar al-Assad actually played a role with the Americans in that there was a policy that the Americans employed of extraordinary rendition, meaning that they would kidnap Muslims, wherever they may be, Muslims that were considered targets, Muslims that were considered a threat. They would be kidnapped and renditioned, transported to places like Syria, where governments like the government of Bashar al-Assad would eventually torture them for America. And I say that, and the reason I mention it is because some people on the left present Bashar al-Assad as some kind of anti-imperial figure, someone that we should support or get behind or feel aggrieved that he's fallen, when really that's nothing of the case. He was a man that never attacked Israel, never intended to attack Israel. Israel is continually occupying the Golan Heights, which is occupied Syrian territory, and he hasn't even for an instance threatened to take that land back, and he has communicated with the Israelis as well as the American government. So this was the role of Bashar al-Assad. Absolute oppression at home, working in cahoots with the Americans in terms of their extraordinary rendition campaign. And then, of course, came the Arab Spring, the upheaval across the Arab world, which all kicked off at the end of 2010 when a young university graduate by the name of Mohammed Bouazizi in Tunisia frustratedly set fire to himself when he was refused or he was prevented or blocked from selling fruit. He was a fruit vendor and he was struggling to make ends meet. Even though he was a university graduate, such was the economic condition in Tunisia, he wasn't able to actually fulfill his ambitions of becoming, someone of a higher status. They refused to allow him to sell fruit because he needed a permit based on new regulations. Out of frustration, he set fire to himself, and that led to an uprising in Tunisia, which led to the fall of the autocrat Ben Ali. And that spread. So we saw the scenes in 2011, in January 2011 in Egypt, with the uprising that led to the fall of Hosni Mubarak, and in Yemen and so on and so forth. And of course, that mood caught on, and it caught on in Syria as well. And it caught on in a specific location. The location is Dar'a. And in Dar'a, there was a group of youth, and one in particular that sprayed some graffiti on a wall. The first part of the graffiti was "Ash-Sha'b yurid isqat al-nizam," which was a famous chant in the Arab world during the Arab Spring, that the people demand the fall of the regime. But he also wrote after that slogan that "Dawraka hada dawraka ya doctor," this is your turn now, doctor. He called him a doctor because Bashar al-Assad, by trade, by profession, is an eye doctor. So that he said, "This is your turn now, yeah, doctor." Now, the youth was caught. He was imprisoned along with 15 other youths that were with him. They were brutally tortured. I mean, some of the things that happened to them, I can't even bear to mention today. And that set off the motion of protests, first in Dar'a, but then it spread across the country in all of the major cities, in Damascus and everywhere else. People rose up because of the injustice of what happened to these children or these youths, but also because of the corruption, because of the autocracy, the brutality, the lack of economic opportunity in that land, and because of what's happening everywhere else in the Arab world. People had lost their fear of the autocracy. They rose up and they challenged the system. Now, unlike in Tunisia and unlike in Egypt, Bashar didn't fall. And there's a reason for that. And it's because of what I mentioned earlier. His father made sure that the deep state was him and his family and his tribe. So unlike Hosni Mubarak, for example, in Egypt, they were able to just let him go. When they realized that, the game's up, let's just take him to one side, he's the sacrificial lamb. That wasn't an option in Syria because the whole system was the Alawis and Bashar. So he wasn't to leave. And in fact, he turned on the protesters and their legitimate demands with absolute brutality, firing on crowds. Day after day after day, the brutality continued. The people started to they were getting massacred and massacred and massacred until Bashar forced this into a military conflict. It went from peaceful protests where everyone was taking part, doctors, nurses, engineers, people from all walks of life, and all of a sudden, because of the immense brutality of what was going on, it turned into a violent conflict and, of course, into a civil war. And the country split into many different enclaves where rebels were effectively governing the country in their own smaller enclaves. Locally appointed councils were making decisions, and so on and so forth. And this, of course, led to many different groups and militant groups emerging to battle against the government. There were many, and I've just listed a few here, as you can see, but the countless different groups. Some of them are of an Islamic leaning, some of them of a secular leaning, like, for example, the Free Syria Army, which was the most famous failed army of the initial stages, Ahrar al-Sham, Jabhat al-Nusra, which we're going to be talking about a lot. ISIS emerged in late 2013, 2014, Jaish al-Islam, Harakat al-Nur al-Din al-Zangi, and so on. Now, the man that you're looking at is the man of the moment. His name is Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, or Ahmed al-Shara'. Now, just as a little bit of background, because it's worth understanding who this individual is, and he's a very interesting individual. He was born in Riyadh. He's actually Syrian of origin. Born in Riyadh because his parents were exiles from the Golan Heights, hence his name Al-Jawlani, right? So he was originally from the Golan Heights, which are now occupied by Israel. He lived in Riyadh, and he himself mentioned that he was politicized by the Second Intifada in Palestine. When he saw what was going on with the abuses of the Palestinian people, he couldn't take it, and that was, I guess you could say, a turning point in his development. In 2003, he went to Iraq to fight against the American occupation forces. Now, in that time, or very soon after that, he was imprisoned in Camp Booker, a very notorious prison that the Americans held at that stage, and he was there for 5 years. And he became acquainted with another notorious individual by the name of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And they became very close in that time. And he actually joined Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's group, which first emerged as Dawlat al-Islamiyya fil Iraq, the Islamic State in Iraq. He was then, once released, and once the actual Arab Spring started to take root in Syria, he was sent to Syria to open up a front in Syria, and he called that front Jabhat al-Nusra. So that was how Jolani ended up in Syria. Then, in 2013-2014, he split with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi when ISIS tried to merge Jabhat al-Nusra into their organization, and he refused. They split, and fighting that happened between these two groups. Jabhat al-Nusra allied themselves with Al-Qaeda, and ISIS effectively took a very militant approach against them. A war emerged between these two groups. And that was very, very crucial because in 2013, going on in 2014, Bashar was wobbling. He was, many people at that time thought, on his last legs, and it all kind of started to collapse around them. Now, at that moment, 2013, 2014, this conflict just got more and more messy, more and more complicated. As I'm about to show you, it became a global conflict because there were so many different actors, all with their own interests, all making sure or trying to make sure that the events would go in their favor, starting with the United States. They, of course, wanted to ensure that the Syrian conflict went in their favor, and for that they were supporting various different groups with money and funds and weaponry. They tried to, as they put it, to fund the moderate rebels as opposed to the extremists, according to them. So they gave and they funneled money and weapons and training to the Free Syria Army, for example. However, that was a disaster. The money that they spent and the weapons that they were giving ended up being funneled to other groups. The Free Syrian Army effectively became the biggest arms dealers in Syria. Then you had the Gulf states at the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. You had the Gulf states that were also funneling funds and money and weapons to various groups that they felt had a good chance of taking control because their fear was that Iran would have or take control of the situation, and that was a direct threat to their political power in the region. They did not want the expansion of Iranian power in the Middle East, so they wanted to ensure that that didn't happen by funding their own groups. And then, of course, we had Iran and their proxies. They entered into this very, very early on, talking about 2013, even before that. And of course, Hezbollah, which is very prominent in the news because of the situation in southern Lebanon these days with the war in Gaza, they entered into this war at the behest of Iran. And of course, they're not puppets of Iran, but they were requested by Iran to go, and they did fight in this conflict, and they did commit many atrocities against Sunni civilians and Sunni groups. They laid siege to many different towns. All kinds of different atrocities occurred under the leadership of Hezbollah at that time, as well as other Iranian proxies. There were many groups from Iraq, Shia groups that came into Syria and fought alongside Assad's government against the Sunni groups in this conflict. And there was ethnic cleansing campaigns that have to be mentioned that took place by the behest of Iran. There were Sunni civilians that were being transported, moved, ethnically cleansed from certain areas of Syria into other areas of Syria so that they could ensure a Shia majority in the areas where they can create, a land canal from Iran to Syria to Lebanon. So there was an ethnic cleansing campaign that was taking place by the leadership of Iran that was horrific at that time, and it's really underreported and it needs to be mentioned. We have Russia that entered into the conflict in 2015. Just at the point in which Bashar al-Assad was close to falling, he requested the support from Russia and they came to his needs. Why? Well, because it was an opportunity for Russia, who projects itself as a global power, to now enter into a very, I guess you could say, an important conflict, a very geostrategically important region of the world. So it was an opportunity for Russia also to enter into the fray. And Turkey was also involved in this and still are very much involved in this. Turkey, of course, took in the most Syrian refugees out of any country in the world. 3.5 million Syrian refugees have been taken in by Syria. But not only that, they also are very fearful of the growth of a group, the YPG, which is an offshoot of the PKK, which is a Kurdish militant group, which the Turks have been fighting for a long time now, and they fear that the growth of this Kurdish group in Syria will be a direct threat to Turkey, so their presence, well, they felt that their presence in Syria was absolutely necessary to stop that from happening. So everyone has their own interests, everyone is involved, and what's happening here is the people of Syria are losing. Because of this, because of the fact that America don't want an all-out victory from any one side in this. They would rather have a frozen conflict where everyone is weak. That would suit them, and it would suit Israel as well, because a collapsed Syrian country would suit and has suited Israel. This is the global dynamics of this conflict, and this is why it has become so messy and why it became eventually a stalemate. And here is the stalemate. It's worth looking at this map because only a few weeks ago, this was the natural state of Syria, I guess you could say since 2019. This is how it became. It became a frozen conflict, and these, as you can see, are the frozen borders of this conflict. 600,000 people approximately have been killed in the years of this conflict. The Syrian country, the infrastructure, completely obliterated. As I said, the frozen borders, the red part represents, until the last few weeks, Bashar al-Assad's rule. The yellow part represents the Kurdish rule by a group called the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. They're not Syrian and they're not democratic, right? The people that actually run it, the Kurds, the main group that run this, they're not really actually Kurdish Syrian nationals. They are supported by America, and they were used by America to fight the ISIS militants as well as other militants that they didn't like in Syria. And also because, as you can see, Deir az-Zor, which is just there on the border between the Assad-controlled area and the yellow area of the Kurds, is the oil-rich region of Syria, which is in the hands of America, and America have effectively been siphoning off those oil revenues for their own benefits for many, many years now. So we have the Assad-controlled areas, we have the American-supported Kurdish-controlled area, and as you can see on the very far west, you have Idlib, which for the last few years was the last rebel enclave. The main group that controlled that was the reincarnation of Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. So in 2016, Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani transformed or repackaged and rebranded that organization, which used to be Jabhat al-Nusra, to Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham, and he disassociated himself from Al-Qaeda. And he transformed his organization into a national liberation organization that had no transnational ambitions beyond the borders of Syria. And that was the main organization, among others, that were ruling over the very, very small enclave of Idlib. And the other main group, as you can see in turquoise color, is the Turks. The Turks were in control of parts of northern Syria. Why? Well, as they say, because of the Kurds. Because they were too worried that the Kurds were going to become out of control. They were going to create a region of Kurdistan. They were going to be a direct threat to the sovereignty of the Turkish state. So that gave Turkey a pretext or a reason to actually have a permanent presence in Syria. And that was the state of play. Since 2019, all the way up to 2024. And even myself, a few weeks ago, I thought, well, that's it. Bashar al-Assad is being reintegrated into the international community. We saw just last year Mohammed and Salman shaking the hand of Bashar al-Assad, bringing him back into the Arab League. And I thought, after all of this, 600,000 people dead, and now Bashar is just being reintegrated, and everyone's just accepted it. I thought this is a disaster. And it was a disaster, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has other plans for His ibad. And the events over the last few weeks caught everybody by surprise. Unless you were in the know about the situation on the ground and what was going on in Idlib. Because in 2021, Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani actually indicated that they were preparing something. In 2021, in a khutbah, he mentioned, be patient, in a couple of years' time we will be ready to launch an offensive. He actually said these words. So if people were listening, then there was something brewing on the ground. And even the Iranians and the Russians had gotten on to the actual idea that something was happening. They were warning Bashar that something was happening. He didn't take heed. And of course, the map initially looked like this. So on November the 27th, the lightning offensive took place. And as you can see, Idlib became Idlib and Halab, or Aleppo. Aleppo being, an extremely significant historic city in Syria, which the rebels, led by HTS, but also comprising many other groups, they took control of Halab, which was an incredible thing. And people thought, wow, that's amazing. But still, people couldn't conceive the fact that Bashar was about to fall. But that was something quite spectacular. What was on my mind was, how are they going to hold this territory? Okay, they've won the territory, but how can they hold it? But then, it just carried on. Day after day, more and more territory started to fall, bit by bit, until all that was left was Damascus and some of the strongholds of the Alawi community, which were on the western side of Syria, as you can see, which is still in red. But by December the 16th, this is what it looked like. Bashar fell, and joyous scenes in Syria and around the world for the fall of a true despicable tyrant. And alhamdulillah, it was an incredible moment, and that moment should never be underplayed, which is what many people are trying to do. They're trying to underplay it. They're trying to say this was a CIA plot or an Israeli plot. Absolute nonsense. There's no evidence to corroborate that in any way, shape, or form. This was an authentic uprising, and the people of Syria are jubilant because of what has happened. Now, there's a couple of questions that present themselves. A couple of questions emerge from what just happened, right? This incredible lightning offensive that has led to the fall of Bashar and opened up an opportunity that will have ramifications for the rest of the Middle East and the rest of the Muslim world and the rest of this ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right, the first one is, okay, oh, and by the way, look, these are the scenes in the Umayyad Masjid, not last Friday, not yesterday, but the week before, when people came and flocked to the masjid and prayed in Masjid al-Ummawi, this incredibly significant masjid. It has eschatological significance, as we know the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that Isa alayhi salam will descend onto the white minarets of this masjid, wallahu a'lam. Now, why now? Why did that happen now and let's say not a year ago or 3 years ago or whatever else? Well, there's a few things at play that has led to it happening in this particular moment. One being Russia's preoccupation with Ukraine. Right, they're still there, they're still being bogged down. Yes, they are winning in that situation, but their resources are being drained, and they don't have the appetite that they had a few years ago that they do now. They just don't, because of the actual, because of the situation, because of what's going on over there. Iran has suffered some major setbacks over the last year because of the situation with Israel. Right, and one of those setbacks is one of their allies, Hezbollah. Their main leaders have been obliterated in their war over, the border between Israel and Lebanon. Hassan Nasrallah, who was the leader of Hezbollah, was killed, as many of his associates, many of his commanders were killed. Hassan Nasrallah Right, Hezbollah, of course, have committed many crimes, as I mentioned, in Syria. But Hassan Nasrallah, you have to understand the significance of him as an individual. He was a larger-than-life individual, incredibly charismatic, intelligent, astute, and really their leader for so many years. And he was killed, he was liquidated, as well as many others. And that was a major blow to Hezbollah. Right, so their presence in Syria was compromised because of the situation that was going on in southern Lebanon. They didn't have the ability to actually stay there in the presence that they had in previous years. Assad himself was refusing to reform his army. The economic situation in Assad-controlled Syria was terrible. Right? The army conscripts were getting paid $4 a month, or $4 to $7 a month, to be in the army, right? That's absurdly low. The generals are getting paid something of the region of $40 a month, the generals of his army. So they were underfunded, under-resourced. Russia said, let's reform your army, we can give you training and we can give you funding, and he refused. Iran later also offered their services, and he refused. Now the question is why? Why would he refuse such a thing? And there is much speculation about that, Allahu A'lam, but I would argue that the main reason he did refuse those overtures from his allies, or supposed allies, is that he was slowly moving towards the Gulf, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, because he was hoping that security would come through an alliance with Israel and an alliance with America via the Gulf regions. He was slowly edging his way away from his traditional allies and towards the Gulf allies, which meant effectively that he was changing tact. Okay, so Assad's reintegration into the Arab League, and of course the Turkish interests in the offensive as well also played a part in what was going on. You see, Erdogan recently won an election, but he lost the popular vote for the first time. And one of the reasons why he lost the popular vote is because of the issue of immigration in Turkey. A lot of Turks are unhappy with the amount of Syrians there. The Syrian immigration problem has been used as a political football in Turkey and has created a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in Turkey. So he wants to find a solution for the Syrian problem, as they put it in Turkey. And also he wants to find a solution to the Kurdish problem in Syria. And he wants to find a way of establishing Turkish opportunity and Turkish rule within the Syrian paradigm. So all of that, as well as the fact that the rebels recognize that it's either now or never. Right, after 4 years of a stalemate, effectively, they recognized that they had to strike. They were systematically and periodically being bombed by Syria and by the Russian Air Force as well, right? And they were looking at the situation. Assad is being reintegrated into the international community. Slowly, people are accepting him as a normal leader again. Right, so if they were just to sit passively by, that would just materialize. They recognized that there was a window of opportunity and now was the time to strike, and they had prepared for this. It wasn't something that was spontaneous. This came years in the making, right? Maybe we weren't aware of this, but the leader of HTS, Ahmed al-Shara, or Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, whatever you want to call him, he was making lots of moves. So he invested enormously in 2020, enhancing combat capabilities, improving professionalism, tightening the structure of the organization, all kinds of things. Right? There were nighttime forces and special forces that were developed in this period. So they were becoming a very professional outfit. Not only that, Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani spent a long time reconciling, speaking to different minorities and different tribes, speaking to the Ismaili Shia tribes, the Druze, the other groups, to ensure that to give them assurances that nothing would happen to them if we were to expand out. He was reconciling with different groups that HTS had been at loggerheads with. So reconciling, creating peace, going and meeting with tribes, Arab tribes, different denominations and different sects, creating a situation or creating a platform where he can then go and do what they have recently done. And HTS also invested heavily in its semi-technocratic Salvation government. So there was a functioning government in Idlib for the last few years that was actually very, very impressive. Much more impressive than the governing structure of Assad's government, even though it was in a very small area. They were providing public services. They were very efficient in the way they were running the country. There were complaints about their authoritarian streak. There were, famously, a British aid worker was imprisoned, and he was very outspoken about the transgressions against him. So they do have these authoritarian tendencies that were well publicized, but by all intents and purposes, they were governing a lot better than anywhere else in that region. Okay, causes for concern. Are there causes for concern? Maybe. And when I say maybe, let's just take a look at this. So it's worth addressing this. As you can see, there are a few headlines here. Even before HTS took control of all of Syria, the Western media, I'm not sure if you noticed, took a very, very favorable position on Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani and HTS, which is very surprising given their position on Hamas, given their position on the Taliban. You would expect them to be, having be consistent about this. But look at this. Just look at some of these headlines. Who is Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani? Polite Syrian leader heads home. How Syria's diversity-friendly jihadists plan on building a state. Moderate jihadist leader storms Syria but tells troops not to frighten children. Right, this is the Western media, come on. Right, we know what the Western media is like in relation to people like us, right? So what's going on here? Why are they so favorable to them? Right, that's the question, isn't it? Also, as we know, Israel has recently bombed Syria quite extensively since HTS has taken control of the whole country. Quite extensively. Over 300 different sites, helicopter sites, Air Force sites, weaponry. It's all been obliterated by Israel, and HTS has refused to actually be outspoken about that. In the early stages, they didn't want to speak about it at all, and then they did speak about it eventually, appealing to international law and the international community to bring an end to the Israeli aggression. So what's going on? What's happening here? And there's a lot of speculation about that. The anti-imperialists on the left are saying, see, look at this. This shows you that they're CIA stooges. This shows you this is an American Zionist thing. This isn't genuine. This isn't real. But that's not it, right? It seems to be the case, and Allah knows best, that HTS, or the inevitability of them taking control, there was a deal that was struck, and HTS has given assurances, or Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani has given assurances to make sure that they will be able to govern without transgression against the West, to ensure or to give assurances to Western actors that their interests are safe, that the Turkish interests are safe, that Russia is safe. Effectively, they are trying to create space for themselves to govern this region effectively without any interference for the foreseeable future, so that they can actually create something of a coherent governance, so that they can recover after 13 years of war, and so on. Right, this is, I guess you could say, the most charitable interpretation of what's going on here, because effectively back channels have been open between the West and Syria and HTS, as they always will be. Back channels between different groups are continuous, and it seems to be the case here. Right, it seems to be a case that they have created for themselves a level of space where they can actually, then go about creating a level of stability and security within this land. Now, the fear or the danger of doing that is if you compromise so much, so early, then what does that mean for the future? If you've already compromised and you've already effectively submitted yourself to Western hegemony, then what does that mean for the future? It's a very difficult question to actually tackle. It could be the case that you could then turn around and say, well, what would you prefer? The continuation of Bashar and his tyranny and this hell that he has meted out against the people of Syria, or an opportunity for something different, for something better, for an opportunity for Islamic governance, which is what they are proposing. They are proposing ruling by the principles of the Sharia. So it gives a space for that possibility to emerge. Effectively, we can't throw a lot in with HTS because we don't know. There are too many unanswered questions. There are too many unanswered questions for what is to happen next. It's something that we need to actually keep a close eye on. However, we can look at the words of Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani and actually, infer what some of the things that he's been saying. So this is the kind of rhetoric that has been coming out over the last week. This is all from him. There is a difference between the Kurdish community and the PKK. So he's saying the Kurds are okay, right? This rebel group, they're the problem here. The form of authority in Syria is left to the decisions and experts and legal experts, and the Syrian people are the ones who decide. Right? We will form communities and councils concerned with restudying the constitution. The exhausted Syrians, listen, the exhausted Syrian situation after years of war and conflicts does not allow for entering into any new conflicts. He's saying we don't want to fight. We don't want to fight Israel. We don't want to fight anyone. We just want to try and build something here. That's the message that he keeps putting out. The priority at this stage is reconstruction and stability, not being dragged into conflicts that may lead to further destruction. We have relations with Christians and Druze who have fought with us within the military operations department. The international community must urgently intervene and assume its responsibilities towards the recent Israeli escalation, and so on. This is just an idea of the messages that he's putting out there and that we can infer from. Okay, challenges ahead, and I'll close in a few minutes, inshallah. Challenges ahead, maintaining unity among the various camps. This is the difficult part now. Right? Bashar has fallen. That void has now opened up. And invariably, when voids open up, when political space opens, then difficulties happen because we have a lot of different groups among HTS and Ahrar al-Sham and others that are now seeing this political space opening, and sometimes that could cause conflict, or it could cause fault lines that are already existing between these groups that used to be fighting one another to re-emerge. So it's important at this stage that a unity is maintained. Providing a flourishing economy and public services is what the Syrians need after years of deprivation and war and destruction and a collapsed economy. Okay, protecting their territorial integrity, this is something very important. Israel seem to be acting with impunity and bombing them whenever and however they want. So, integrity and security is something important that they need to establish. How? That remains to be seen. Balancing the global powers is something they're going to have to work with here, with Russia, with America, with China. This is the balancing act that they now have to play. And regional powers looking to derail this experiment. This is important. If you remember, in 2011, when the Arab Spring started to fall apart, it did so largely because of the counter-revolutionary forces in the region, namely Saudi Arabia and the UAE. They were the principal counter-revolutionary forces because they would not tolerate a successful Arab Spring. Because a successful Mohammed Morsi in Egypt would mean that people across the region would want this. So there are forces within the Middle East that are looking to Syria thinking we can't allow this experiment to be successful, because if it's successful, these things have a habit of catching on. They have a habit of spreading. And for autocracies like Mohammed bin Zayed and Mohammed bin Salman in UAE and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Egypt, that's not an option. Okay? Dealing with misconceptions, I'll be very quick, inshallah. Now, some people say, well, this is a real setback, particularly on the left. They're saying this is a setback. This is a problem because the only people that were resisting Israel were Iran, the axis of resistance. It was Hezbollah, it was Ansar Allah, the Houthis in Yemen. Right? These were the people that were seemingly to be the resistance against Israel. Well, not necessarily true. Right, of course, we can't deny the situation with Ansar Allah, the Houthis, and Hezbollah, and the fights that have been, the skirmishes that have been taking place. But the Hezbollah have since signed a peace treaty with Israel, and the axis of resistance in its reality is the protection of Iranian interests in the region. Iran has ambitions in the region, which is their expansion and their political control of the region. It always has been that way, and that is always the ultimate goal of their so-called axis of resistance. Really, it's a way of them consolidating and expanding their power in the region, which is ultimately not to our benefits, it's to our detriment in the long run. So this axis of resistance, really, it's a certain branding, and we need to actually be privy to that reality. Okay, the uprising was Western-backed? No, I mean, there's no real evidence that suggests that. Just as in 2011, some people are suggesting that it was an American-backed uprising. This is an authentic uprising from the people of Syria that want to shake off the yoke of oppression. It's real, and it came from the people of Syria. Okay, HTS are Western puppets and a CIA plot. That's another misconception. I mean, there's no evidence to suggest such. Like I said, there is a suggestion that there is communication and agreements and assurances that are being made between them. I think that's clear. But in terms of being puppets of the CIA, I think it's far-fetched. Okay, I'll close here. Hopes and lessons. Okay, the first thing is the emergence of a successful militarily strong Islamist, meaning people that want to rule, I hate using that term, forgive me, but people that want to rule by the Sharia, right, as a neighbor in the Middle East, shows the rest of the Arab world how a weak people, weak in quotes, can topple the strong. It once again gives hope to the region. After the Arab Spring fell apart, that hope started to fade, but all of a sudden, people are starting to dream, people are starting to see it, starting to look beyond the autocracies that are dragging them down at this moment in time. The revolutionaries in Egypt and Tunisia, it seems, were not revolutionary enough. The Ikhwan al-Muslimin in Egypt and Nahda in Tunisia thought that they could go through that political process, thought they could use democracy to change the system. Unfortunately, the deep state came and swallowed them up. What this seems to suggest is that by force of arms, by strength of arms, by removing that deep state, that is the route that can be taken towards actual real change, actual real revolutionary change that will lead to perhaps a brighter future. And as I said, Syria could provide a powerful lesson in how a rebel movement gains national legitimacy. And of course, the counter-revolutionary forces are very worried about that. And I'll leave it at this. Revolutions wax and wane, but they don't die. The legitimate grievances of the people, they're real and they exist. And their aspirations are real and they exist. And it can never be pressed down in infinitum. It has to change, and the situation will change, and it always will change. The will for the people to live under the Sharia, to live under an authentic sense of self-determination, that feeling will never die, regardless of how bleak the situation looks in the short term. As we have seen, things can turn very, very quickly. وَتِلْكَ الْأَيَّامُ دَاوِلَهَا بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that these days of the dunya, we alternate them between the people. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless this uprising in Syria and to give the Syrian people every opportunity for a successful revolution. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين من كل ذنب. جزاكم الله خير. I think I'll close there.